was an HVAC chase that went up in the building. We took it out, and then fortunately we still had the doors coming back on. The gateway here, love it with the arrowhead on top. That, of course, is an excellently secure place. Everyone obeys that, right? So, and this is our old back door right here. This is our back door. This is where it stopped. See the terrazzo change? So we stepped out here. We were on the WP campus. Well, on the next part of the WP campus. Okay, so our back windows, those were filled in, and then here. This addition was started before the war, and this is where the brick drive comes in. The original fundraising effort was strictly cash. It was strictly money. The brick drive happened for the second edition. New Deal monies were used to pour the basement. What was called Texas Centennial monies was used to pour the basement in 1936. So we had a basement addition and there's some debate about whether or not CCC labor was used to dig part of it. We can't really nail that down. So we had a basement here in 1936. And I failed to mention that the two WPA murals in there actually came through the federal government's recognition of the 500th anniversary. It was called the Coronado Cuarto Centennial Commission. 500th anniversary of Coronado coming through here. And we know he came through here, so they gave us those monies, not only for the murals, but also exhibit furniture. So much of the old exhibit furniture was funded under that grant, as well as many of the murals in natural history. Those were painted by Gustav Sundström under that grant. So it was actually given to us for exhibits, and we took some of it for mural painting. Now, this is where I always talk about what is the Panhandle-Plains. And we tend to be Texas-focused, but that's just part of what we are. It also includes parts of New Mexico, Colorado, Kansas, and Oklahoma. That's critical. And frankly, I think we need to be throwing our loop out there in terms financially as well. Because these folks are also far away from their centers. They are. And people from in Liberal, where do they go to shop? They come to Amarillo, for example. Same thing here. So something just to think about. But this helps people better understand what the Panhandle-Plains region is. That's the reason for the hype, right? It's a specific geographical place. Now, what we wanted to do in People of the Plains, remember, this is phase one. People of the Plains was a two-part exhibition plan in 1999, 2000. Does that sound right, Buster? Is that right? Yeah. The second part was called Sense of Self, and it was going to go where Harrington is now. We never finished it. So what this is, it talks about this is a hard place for humans to live. And we picked out certain subject areas that are dealt with that, and that's how I approach it. I don't spend a lot of time on the timeline because it's pretty self-explanatory. I might talk about some of the artifacts that are inside here. Yano Theater does a nice job as an introductory film. Always best if it works. And so that I think helps people orient. First thing we talk about is water. And remember, this photograph of Lake Meredith was taken about 1999 or 2000 and still had water in it. And when I was leading tours during the drought, it was an opportunity. And I'm not a tree hugger. I'm not a PC guy, and I always say that. But human beings waste stuff. We just do, especially if we think there's a lot of stuff, right? And I don't spend a lot of time here. I try really hard to stay off my water soapbox. But, you know, God above put grass out here for a reason. He made Iowa, Nebraska for corn. Because there's water there. Corn doesn't belong here. That's just my feeling. So I better stop there. Come on here.
Well, just as kind of an intro, what I say in here as this whole People of the Plains exhibition area focuses on what the humans who have occupied this Panhandle-Plains region for 14,000 years, what tools they use to adapt to the environment.
Yeah,
they have changed over time. You can see in the water thing the different ways that people have come up with to carry their water because they had to take it with them because there wasn't any water until we had windmills where they...
And they lived along the water courses, and we'll talk about that when we get around the corner. This is where I take off the elementary school teachers, right here, because they are taught that the Indian used every part of the buffalo. Well, Indians are human beings too. And if there's lots of a resource, they waste it. We waste it. Human beings waste stuff. We just do. And so here's why I asked them about how did Indians kill buffalo before they had horses. Anybody know?
Drove them off a cliff.
Right, okay. So you drive 200 buffalo off a cliff, right? Mm-hmm. And they're dead and dying at the bottom of the cliff, as you see here, right? Okay, fortunately they have cherry pickers and front end loaders so they can unload each carcass strategically and butcher them before they rot. Yes?
Mm-hmm.
And that's when they start to get mad. And I said, you have to remember that it's a human thing. And so hunting buffalo off a cliff was a great waste of resources. There was no possible way they could use every part of the buffalo. We know there are documented cases of Indians killing a single buffalo, cutting out the heart, and eating it and riding away. You know why? Because there's always another one. And now, Anglos took it to a whole new level. That's important, though, to set the context. Bloody Buffalo movie, I don't let people watch it when I'm here because it's just too cool, right? My kids love the Bloody Buffalo movie. And I talk a little bit about our archaeological, anthropological collections here, but I am not a scientist, so I don't spend much time here. And then I talk about the shift from finding food this way to producing food here, using the cousin of the bison, grass-eating critter, but you had to get the bison out of the way. Now, I happen to believe, this is just me talking, the attempts to domesticate the buffalo was an attempt to use that product. It's basically about product. But buffalo are untamable. You can't do it. So domesticated cousins, then I don't want to belabor you with cowboys, but if you have any questions about this, this is the time to ask them.
I'd say go ahead and talk about.
Okay.
Yeah.
Talk about this exploding cowboy too. People
Okay.
find that
Okay,
fascinating.
that's good. Okay. We talked about branding, which is a Spanish technology, how to mark your animals. And I'll go into this into some detail. The first cattle in North America arrived probably 1521. Spanish herding practices, they did not castrate the bull calves. So they just ran wild. And ultimately what happens is, and you're going to find an ironic twist here, there are millions of cattle in Central America and what's now Mexico, but that's New Spain, remember? So there are millions of them, okay? And the herding, they didn't fence, right? So to use that resource, to use that product, it simply meant they used a cattle herding technique they learned from North Africa, okay? I can't pronounce the Spanish word, but on horseback, remember, Spain is conquered by the Moors in the 8th century, right? So it's almost exclusively a Muslim country for 600 years, right? 1492 when they're expelled. That's important. But that herding technique was not practiced in Spain until the Moors come. They herded animals on the back of horses using a long pole with a crescent-shaped blade on the back. And that wasn't to tend them, that was to cut their hamstrings. You cut the hamstrings with that, and you butcher them on the spot. You peel off the hide, you render as much tallow as you can, and you leave the rest to rot. Does that sound familiar? It's exactly what happened to the bison. Exactly. Do you know why? Because there were millions of them, right? And there was no proper way to butcher the meat. And so the meat was usually left, okay? And they're doing what cows do. They're making more cows, and they're everywhere. Originally, okay, and then also 16th century, late 16th century, West African slaves are brought to New Spain, and they use something called a rope, right? And that combination of technologies, but these West Africans roped from foot for two reasons. One, that wasn't part of their technology, and two, they were not allowed to ride horses or mules, okay? So that roping technology is suddenly on the back of a horse, you see? And that changes everything. So what I'm telling you is Cowboy Ground Zero is Africa. There are some who argue it's Ireland and England. It's not. I mean, there's too much new research on that. So Cowboy Ground Zero is West Africa. And ultimately it's filtered through Spain, through Mexico, and then up into Texas. Cowboying basically starts here and spreads in two ways, north and west, up into California. And therefore you get different styles of cowboy gear. You have the Californios and the Vaqueros out west and in South Texas. Then you have the flat hat cowboys in the Great Basins, bigger hats, and that's even true today. Montana cowboys tend to wear the Smoky Bear hats, for example. Down here in Texas, they tended to use that kind of crease. And they were big and flat initially. Okay, so that's important to remember that cowboying is not the same. But the important thing is to remember that the whole thing started here. And then started in Mexico, and then in Spain, and then in North Africa and West Africa. That's the backward way you can do it. So branding is...
Why do you think this area is attributed to being the cowboy mecca as opposed to somewhere in Africa or Spain or whatever?
It's new research.
Okay.
Plus, frankly, it's a bigoted way to do the history.
Okay.
I mean, it is. I mean, it just is.
Yeah, no.
So that's part of it. So this is a Spanish technology to mark your cattle. Remember, they're running wild when you had no fences, so you did brand them, okay? And we have one of the early brands out here. We actually have some in the collection that are at least mimic things like what Stephen F. Austin used, and they're much more ornate. And so this is a whole another technology here. So the cowboy costume that you see here, the gear, hats get bigger and smaller, they change styles and so on. Ours is a Plains cowboy. Plains cowboys tended to dress a certain way, and it's all based on regional preferences here. Big hat, sombrero tejana, right? Most of them wore a wild rag. Most of them out here, Texas cowboys tended to be much more practical. And you're getting a little Cowboy Mike spiel here, okay? And this is where we use the math component for you educators. You know, we tried to hit all the components when we do T-Anchor and Cowboy Mike, right? We do science and technology, and we do math, and we do fine arts. I'll get to that in a minute. Okay, so the wild rag, they call it a wild rag today. None of this silk stuff wrapped around your neck 100 times with that pretty slide you wear to cowboy church, you know, right? Texas cowboys didn't do that. They go to the general store and they buy a yard of cotton cloth in whatever color was available, and knot it around their neck and wear it till it rotted off. It was basically your first aid kit, okay? Did a lot of things, you know, dust masks, tear it into strips for bandages and so on, tie your hat on, all kinds of stuff. So it's basically you're looking at a toolkit, because there's no going back to the pickup to get something that you forgot, because once you were mounted, you stayed mounted. There are two different types of cowboys before I go any further. The trail driving is not the same. Those are drovers. Trail driving, let me back up. Lo, these many years ago. 1866, post-Civil War, the South is greatly depressed. Reconstruction. The reason Texas survives is beef. They had that product. Cotton was largely depleted by this time. Texas had part of that, but it was cattle. Getting cattle to a new demand in the Midwest, the East Coast, and in England. We had the product. Around 10 million wild cattle in Texas after the war. At least 2 million wild horses in Texas after the war. So how do you get them there? Why don't you ship them on Texas railroads? Because we had them. Because it was 10 times as expensive to ship them by rail from South Texas than it was to drive them north to new railheads in Kansas. Okay? So cattle driving companies, like subcontractors, like you hire a roofer, would come to a ranch and say, I will take your herd to Abilene, or Caldwell, or Ellsworth, or Dodge City, and it moved west, for X amount of dollars per head, usually $1 a head. I have my own crew, I bring my own horses. Because by this time, ranches are established, and trail driving is the hardest kind of cowboy. It really is, okay? Really hard on the horses, and especially hard on the men. And you hear these stories about, well, you know, my great-granddaddy, he went up the trail about 10 times, right? Probably not. Grandpa's probably a liar. Most of them did it once, and this is what Byron Price told me, because he's researched it more than anybody. Most of them did it once, and most of them quit halfway. And they hire new people because it was just too hard. Oh, so the ranch horses stayed on the ranch, the ranch cowboys stayed on the ranch. So you had drovers, and then you had ranch hands, okay? During roundups, you brought in usually day work people or seasonal work people. So basically three types of cowboys, okay? So, rest of the costume, most of them wore a vest, a chaleco in Spanish, and a lot of the words are Spanish. You wore a vest usually to keep your body warm and had a lot of pockets for your stuff, especially your cell phone. I always say that. Because cowboys get lonely and they like to Snapchat each other. The slicker that you see, this isn't an oilskin slicker, but that was usually tied behind the saddle. Any kind of pants they wore were either wool, cotton duck, and I don't have any wool pants, which they call the California pant. They're really hot. Cotton duck, I have some of those. They're pretty hot too. And there were no Wranglers, so the only true cowboy jeans are Levi's waist overalls. Everybody wore suspenders. The only way to keep your pants up. Leggings, like you see here, and cuffs. The cuffs are sort of an 1890s thing, and Hollywood picks that up. Some cowboys wore them, some of them didn't. Boots are an invention after the Civil War. A couple of different places hire boots in Olathe, or the other one is Justin, down near Nakona. Those are the two places that claim it. It's actually a combination of a Prussian army boot, a U.S. cavalry boot, and also some English riding boots. Okay. Do I need to tell you about the heels and all that? You all want to know about that?
Yeah.
Tall heels. You can kind of see it in there. They were really tall. They tended to be stovepipe all the way up to the knee. The scallop happens about 1910, give or take. because it's more comfortable, right? They were tall for protection. A lot of cowboys rode with their trousers in their pants because it's the only pair of pants they own. They don't like getting muddy. The rest of them were covered with stuff. But anyway, so the high heels are for protection, mainly because unlike what you see cowboys riding today, I can't get my tension in there. They rode on the instep here. You sunk your foot all the way in because you were in the saddle most of the time. Today, most cowboys ride on the ball of the foot. So that tall heel, say this is the tread on the stirrup, that tall heel, my thumb, keeps your foot from sliding through and getting hung up. That was one of the two great fears of a cowboy, was getting stuck in the saddle or to drown, because most of them couldn't swim. And in Texas, they were always crossing rivers. That's a lonesome dove thing, right? So the tall heel is here. It's raked in the back because it just made it more effective when you had to be on the ground. And most cowboys in the day would mount to ride across the street. You're welcome to try on Cowboy Mike's boots sometimes. They are extremely uncomfortable to walk around in. And to stand around in for 3 hours, not fun. Spurs or espuelas, not to jab your horse. We like to say they're for encouragement. Most cowboys out here couldn't afford fancy spurs. They couldn't. They rode what's called an OK spur, very common. Most of them got them by mail order. You could buy them for $1 a pair from Monkey Ward's or Sears. Okay? Gloves, if you had them, but they wore out real fast. Okay, so the gloves are good. And of course, remember this is 2001 when we put that phone in there.
Maybe we put
Probably time to replace the phone.
put
Right?
an iPhone in there.
And then you got your truck keys there too. That's good. Fence pliers. Cowboys hated making fence. They hated it because they couldn't do it from the back of a horse. Okay. Barbed wire we'll talk about here in a minute. The museum has an extensive collection of barbed wire. Joseph Glidden did not invent barbed wire. He was one of the first to patent it. He owned half the frying pan. So he was here. He was from Illinois, but he was from here. This is a grass rope or a hemp rope. Initially, lariatas were rawhide, but they tend to be brittle and they tended to break. Now, a couple of things about roping technology is vaqueros do what's called dar la vuelta. Buster, what does that mean in English? Dally. Yeah. It means to wrap around. Dar la vuelta. Wrap around. So the vaquero tradition is you rope the animal and you wrap around. And as I like to say out in California, the land of the fruits and the nuts, right? They care about the feelings. So when you dally, you coax them to the fire. Make them think it's their idea. Because you don't want to hurt their feelings or their self-esteem, right? In Texas, they were tie-fast men, and they dragged them. Hence, the riatas in Texas were shorter, usually made of hemp. Vaquero rope is anywhere from 80 to 100 feet long. A Texas rope, 25 to 30. Now, tie-fast is harder on the horses, and it's also harder on the stock. The Texas Cowboys had a reputation for just doing the job and moving on. It's just how it was. Remember out in California, that vaquero tradition. So, that was real quick. Really, this time for questions. Because I could get hit by a truck today, and you'll have to do this. Okay.
Just be careful crossing
Okay.
the street.
Cowboy food, real quickly. Did they eat a lot of beans? Yes. The reason they ate so many beans is because it was cheap. It was inexpensive food. Ranch managers tended to cut every corner they could, and so beans they did eat. And this is the fine arts component for the teachers because it provides musical accompaniment. And they like that when I say it, okay? So chuck wagon, was it invented by Goodnight? Possibly. He probably invented the first practicable one, right? And it's basically what he did was take our chuck box that's in there. That's sort of the Magna Carta of chuck boxes, right? He put it in the back of a military ambulance. Now, when we hear ambulance, we think medical vehicle. No, an ambulance was simply a light wagon, okay? And so the ambulance that we have in World War I, Great War, is very similar to the wagon he used, only it was smaller. Basically a rolling kitchen. How do you make it practical? Because up to this point, a cowboy, a drover, carried his own food in a sack hanging off his saddle horn or off the saddle string. And they ran out of food all the time. So how do you feed your just like feeding an army, you got to be able to feed them. So the rolling chuck wagon. They ate a lot of beans. They ate some beef, but you tended not to eat your own beef because that costs you money. They also could catch game, shoot game, buffalo, antelope, deer, turkeys, and whatever. Prairie chickens when they weren't in danger, and so on. A cowboy's favorite meal when he got to town was fried chicken. And that flies in the face if beef is what for dinner. They love chicken because most of them were Southerners, and they grew up eating chicken. And you couldn't have chicken out here, especially when you're on a trail drive or on a ranch, because chickens didn't survive out here. So chicken was a favorite. The cook nearly always made a dessert, usually a pie or a cobbler. We don't have any canned. We need some canned peaches in here, by the way. They love canned peaches, which cowboys called airtights, because that was a new technology to seal up food in a can. And so they loved that. It's also one of the few times they got any sugar. And the molasses jar was always under attack by cowboys. That was sort of a breach of etiquette to touch the cook's wagon. You'd really get in trouble if you did that. All right, so let's see. Coffee, warm or hot? Those are the only drinks. Coffee or water. Didn't have any Coca-Colas. No Dr. Pepper, okay? Hence, the food wasn't very good, and they tended to be kind of wiry. They tended to be small. No big cowboys, simply because, and if you repeat this, I'll have to kill you. Cowboys initially did not ride quarter horses. There weren't any yet. And I know they say that all the time, but just to be accurate. Hence, the horses were small. Cow ponies were little. Some of them Mustangs, and they tried to crossbreed them pretty early on. They bred them up, that's for sure. And so big cowboys were too hard on the horses and tended to be discouraged. Now, you'll often see in a cowboy crew Big John or Big Luke or whatever, and he's always riding a tall horse because they were rare. So cowboys were small, about my size. I'm just older and fatter than most of them. Most of them 15 to 25 years old. Most were illiterate. Most missed their mommies because they're just kids. And most of them had read about the romantic lifestyle, and they came out here and found out it was too damn hard to work. The standard cowboy wage between 1880 and 1930 was $1 a day. $1.
And who was the highest paid on the drive?
Straw boss was, and he made $50.
And the cook.
And the cook. Right. Cook was next.
If you had a good cook, and could keep a good cook.
And that was, Becky said the key is keeping a good cook, because it was hard on them too. Remember, they set out breakfast at before they could see, 3 to 4 a.m., and then move on for dinner and so on. All right, I need to keep moving. Farming over here. This is really our Pioneer Town story, and I sort of suggest that in there. This is taking way too long, I'm sorry.
You have to peel off Sam's recording this,
right.
And we will make it available on the...
Okay, we had a great influx of people after 1890 up to about 1910. Becky talked about that a lot in the signage that's in Pioneer Town. Many of them were Volga Germans, which is a part of the Russian steppes, and they bring with them Russian red winter wheat, which is perfect for dry land agriculture out here. It grew very well. And then we thought we could improve on it. We bring out corn and cotton and all these other things. We had natural prairie hay, and it was harvested just like anything else. I mean, big, big tall grasses and so on. So this talks about farming, and especially after that influx of the 1890s, and juxtaposes farming technologies over here with more recent technologies here. We used to have a scale there to weigh yourself in relation to a buffalo, but it never worked. This actually works. We've never fired it up since I've been here, but it actually works. And then the film over there talks about that too. Over here?
And just so you know, cotton balls like you buy in the store don't come directly out of cotton bolls.
Right.
Over here. Gotta get moving. Not very many natural building materials out here, and so we juxtapose living housing traditions with a pet house over here and a model house that you could buy from Sears and Roebuck. Remember, after the trains get here by 1890, and Rock Island gets here in the mid-90s, but it's the Santa Fe and the Fort Worth, Denver City. It was amazing how much mail order was done. It was the Amazon of the day, literally, from mainly Sears and mainly Montgomery Wards. And from Sears, you could buy a model house. We come out with the parts numbered and taught you how to put it together. This is a model we picked, and you see houses like this still in and around the rural communities. Over here, we juxtapose building tools and so on, and also some images of houses. I tend to take visitors in there and talk about entertainment was not electronic. It was usually reading or music playing or singing in the evening, and you went to bed when it got dark, I think, because they were bored. That's just what I think. Over here, I don't spend a lot of time over here other than I make everybody go through the tunnel.
Veronica, can you talk a second about it? Just what you did for your staff favorite, or share a little bit about what you talked about?
I'd rather...
I'll just say what I normally say. I talk about the fact that there were complex living situations along the water courses. We can talk a little bit about the Antelope Creek people and what we think happened to them. Apache raiders, probably that came down from the north, as well as with drought. And as I understand it, they either went west or they went northeast, or probably a combination of both, and were absorbed. They may be Wichitas, as what Wichitas are today. They lived in subterranean, partly subterranean houses. The door was blocked up with a rock, and you can see in the model over there. And is that the same model that's in the front? Mm-hmm. Just a small one? Yeah. Okay. So we could talk about that, and then also in here, the goods that were found in our excavations. And this is an opportunity to talk about our long-term track record here at this museum and during all different kinds of excavations, because we were right in the middle of it in the late 20s and 30s, and it was early Ireland. Did you say 1912?
Yeah, 1911.
Okay, so we were really heavily involved with it quite early. That Tularosa pot down there talks about the trade network, and that's a ancient Pueblos pot that came from western New Mexico, probably where the Four Corners region. And so that trade network was largely on foot. The Apaches come down first in one wave, roughly about 1,500 or so, and then the Comanches come behind them about 1,700. And so it's a different waves, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. We talk about this as being a sort of a cutaway of how excavations are done. I tend to talk about what they do after they're done, the backfilling, simply because of vandalism and pot hunting. That's why we backfill. It's fairly accurate, I think, still. Would you say?
Sure.
Okay. It is what it is. Follow me.
I mean, those are all the tools that we use.
Right. Here's where I don't say much, because I don't know anything about clothing. I just say we have an extensive costume and flat textile collection. You can look at bits and pieces in the discovery drawers there. That's generally all I say. I tell people they can come back and read the labels at their leisure. This way.
Bob, I will say one thing about this case. This case is all about how the clothing that we wear says something about our personality. So, you know, I don't know, is it in the drawer? Yeah, there's a peace symbol here. There's, you know, the beautiful beading. It says our clothing can say who we are and what our beliefs are. And that's what that one case is kind of about. That.
I do want to clarify a couple of things about Antelope Creek, if I can. There's so much that we don't know in terms of their origins and sort of where they disappeared. The other major thing that I'd like to say is that there have been hundreds of Antelope Creek houses that have been found. Most of them are very small hamlet-type houses. So what you see here is a representation of one of two of the very large settlement villages. So when you think of Antelope Creek, they're not necessarily huge settlement villages like this. They're actually isolated, you know, households for a small family. And the other thing that I'm starting to learn is that there's so much variety in the architecture of Antelope Creek. We sort of think that they're these stone slab, and they were in the big villages, and they are in some of the houses, but there's also picket fences. Some of them are actually pit houses that were later evolved into above ground structures. So what we know about Antelope Creek has been very skewed by the two major excavations that were done at the large village settlements. And our understanding of these peoples, both where they came from, where they went, how they lived, and the differences among them is changing quite a bit.
May I make a suggestion? Why don't we, after I finish with, no, it's good, Comancheros and Hispanic peoples and adobe walls, and we'll do part deux another day. Would that work? Because I know everybody's busy. Would that be all right? I know you all have appointments and so on. So come over here real quick. Come on over here. I always say that to the groups anyway because you all get scared. This is where we largely touch on Hispanic peoples that were here. And I've done a good bit of research in this area simply because I'm fascinated by it. This is mainly directed towards Comancheros, but Comancheros are just one wave of Hispanics that come out of primarily northern New Mexico. But they are also somehow disconnected from those Hispanic peoples because they're a different type of people called Genizaros, detribalized Indians, okay? I'll get to that in a minute. But initially, a treaty with Governor de Anza, the Spanish governor in Santa Fe, after he defeats Cuernavaca, or Cuernaverde, in southern Colorado, Greenhorn, and carries his head into the Santa Fe Plaza and says, I have defeated all the Comanches. Yeah, right, okay. But you have to understand, this is where we can really talk specifically about Comanches and then conclude over here. Remember, they're another wave of people, right? And the Panhandle-Plains region is a series of displacements in humans. We talked about the people that settled along the waterways, and as Veronica says, we don't really know where they went. Displaced by Apachean peoples, and when the Comanches come down, they're basically kicked out of Wyoming because nobody could get along with them, and they can't get along with anybody. Comanche is a Ute word that means people who fight with us all the time. Numunu is what they call each other, right? The people. And that's an important concept that